So why don't we start? Zach Raff, Assistant Professor of Economics at UW-Stout, will provide an overview of CAFOs and water quality in Wisconsin. Over the past 30 years, livestock operations in Wisconsin, primarily dairies, have become more and more concentrated. This concentration of the industry has led to the proliferation of CAFOs in the state, which provide operational cost savings, but are associated with several forms of external costs, for example, non-point source runoff. He will discuss the past, present, and future of the livestock industry in Wisconsin and the effects on surface water quality from the rise in CAFOs. Sorry, the dog's barking. Over the past 30 years in the state, focusing on the economic implications and mechanisms behind the estimated impacts. He will also provide policy recommendations to better control these external costs. Welcome, Zach. Thank you.
Hey, thanks a lot. And I'll try not to just speak like an economist for 30 straight minutes. So hopefully that helps. So I have slides. Is it possible if I can share my screen? I think I need to be given permission.
Oh. Steve, you're muted. I don't know if you responded to Zach or not.
Yeah, I'm working on it. Give me a second. I can't respond and do it at the same time. You should be fine now.
Okay. Okay, so does everything look great?
Yep.
Okay, well, maybe my slides don't look great. They're boring. My wife always teases me that my slides are boring, so there's a couple pictures in here for everybody. But thank you for the introduction. Yeah, my name is Zach Raff, and I'm an economist over at UW-Stout. And the project that I'm going to be talking about today really is looking at something that's extremely important in the state of Wisconsin. So I'm originally from Sheboygan, Wisconsin, and I grew up wearing cheese on my head. So I really wanted to do research that matters for the state, and try and sort of figure out some issues that are happening given the dairy industry in the state, and really try and help solve some of these problems and make sure that we can, a thing that I always like to say is we can have both cheese and fish in this state. And the way that things are going, it's sort of looking like we're going to have to choose one or the other. But there's certainly some ways to get around this issue, and that's what I'll talk about today. Steve, anybody who wants to, please shout me down if I'm talking too long. I think I'll go for about a half hour. And please, economists were very well known for being extremely rude during seminars. So I'm used to it, but just feel free to ask questions throughout. I'm not saying that's rude, but I'm way worse than questions throughout. So please feel free to interrupt if you have questions throughout. Like I said, I'll try and make the talk a little bit more for a general audience than just saying. I'll joke again. My wife always yells at me. I have to get up and leave the dinner table every time I say opportunity cost. So I'll probably not use too many econ terms. So just a little bit of background, where we're at, where the industry is going. The concentration of the industry is really, really coming to a head. So we've had extreme technological change and these economies of scale. So economies of scale, meaning when you can buy more and more and more, you're going to have much lower average cost in your production. So the technology that allows for having several hundred head of, so again, I will focus on dairy because that's the majority of CAFOs and large farms in our state, but this goes for all animal livestock as well. We have better technology. We have the ability to buy feed at scale, which will really decrease costs. So there's a debate whether or not The concentration in the industry is a result of policy where, things like the Farm Bill are really promoting that quantity. The more you produce, the more you get rewarded. Or whether it's this idea of technological change and these economies of scale. And, obviously as an economist, we tend to focus more on the latter. So it's this ability to really increase your operation is going to make your costs cheaper on average. So when I'm if I'm a dairy, then I'm better off having 1,000 cows than I am having 25 cows. And this concentration is really stemming from these economics. So the past several decades, this idea of CAFOs really took off in about the 1980s, early 1990s. And what's been happening, what we've been seeing in the US is that the number of livestock operations, or the number of farms, the number of dairies, the number of poultry operations, it's decreased considerably. And the number of animals at each operation is really increasing. So one stat that'll really make this known is that in the US dairy production, so this is throughout the entire country, the midpoint herd size. So this means that half of all farms have herd sizes larger than this, and half of all farms have herd sizes smaller than this. In 1992, that was 101 head. So there were, half of all dairy farms were larger than 101 head, half were smaller. In 2012, this number has increased to 900. So we're really exploding. We're really seeing just the industry getting bigger and bigger and bigger and having less operations. And again, really focusing on Wisconsin, this trend is extremely pronounced. If you look at these numbers, it's absolutely crazy how this concentration has occurred so quickly. So in 1965, there were 2 million cows in Wisconsin. Now we only have 1.3 million cows. So you would think, okay, there's clearly a decrease in cows. But what we're seeing at the same time is that the increase in cows on each farm is shooting up considerably. So there used to be, again, when there were 2 million cows, we had 100,000 dairies in the state. Now we have 1.3 million, but there's 7,000 dairies only. So we are losing a lot of these small family farms. And what's happening is they're basically consolidating or crowding out these farms, and they're just becoming more and more concentrated. So this is a very telling chart that I took from UW Extension. And if I'm red-green colorblind, so it always upsets me when I see things like this. But what you'll see is the downward trend. I don't know what color that is. I think it's darker, so I'm going to guess green. But the downward trend is the number of dairies in the state. And what you'll notice is that this ends in 2001. So what we've seen in the last 20 years is this trend is even continuing further down to that about 7,000 number. And the increasing trend, which is the average herd size, well, we now have that 1.3 million cows on 7,000 dairies. So that value is actually increasing even more than what you see in this chart. The average herd size now is about 185. So if we see this cross, if we continued this 20 more years, the cross would continue to be even more extreme. So Wisconsin is really seeing this concentration of the industry. So what does this mean? What is happening? Well, the change in these operations, it's led, as we heard in the introduction, to this proliferation. So proliferation really is the key word for what's happening in the dairy industry or in the livestock industry, not only in Wisconsin, but throughout the United States. And these are called CAFOs. And many people have heard of this term. In essence, it is 1,000 animal units on site that are covered. So people often say these are confined operations. So it's just a whole bunch of animals under one roof, not your traditional grazing livestock operations. And so just for a little bit of context, this 1,000 animal units is about a pound of live weight. So a dairy operation, when it reaches about 700 dairies, then that's considered a CAFO if the animals are confined. And I don't talk too much about the regulations, but CAFOs they're more permitted, they're more regulated, they're required in Wisconsin. Believe it or not, Wisconsin actually has some of the strongest CAFO regulations in the country. They're required to receive Clean Water Act permits as point source dischargers. They're not allowed to discharge during dry weather. So there's really this idea of this is sort of the value that we start to take notice is when we have about 700 dairies.
Question, Zach.
Yeah, Steve.
On that slide, you have 1,000 animal units for at least 45 days,
Mhm.
which prompts me to ask, why would they not have that? Why would it not be for the full year? Or
So
could you
this-
comment on that?
Yeah, the 45 days actually makes it easier because most of these operations do confine their animals for the entire year, but the 45 days then makes it so it's a broader umbrella, right? Because some of these operations do allow they do move the animals around slightly, but 45 days is really sort of saying, well, any amount of time, in essence, if you're confining this many, you're going to be considered a CAFO. So the idea behind that 45 days is to say, well, a lot have the animals confined for 365 days, but 45 is now we're drawing in more potential operations.
Okay, thanks.
So here's like I said, I'm an economist, and I admit economists are boring people. Okay, so here's some pictures. I'm sure we've all seen the CAFOs around here. Speaking to people in Dunn County, we certainly have CAFOs. I live up on Tainter Lake, so there's one right on B that's past my house. You've probably seen the Alpha Lawn just south of town in Downsville. This is how the operations work. There's a whole bunch of cattle, and as you'll notice, the dairy cows are basically in their confinement. They're stuck here. So here's what it looks like from the top, and what you'll see. I don't know. Can you see I don't know if you can see my mouse or my cursor, but here's where the problem is going to get. Now, I don't want to spoil it too much, but it really is all a question about the manure. And what we see at these facilities is there's a lot of manure, and we see the pits. So again, drive down Highway 40 past Colfax, you'll see one of these right down on the side of the road. So this is what the CAFOs look like from on top. There really are concentrated. So it's a whole bunch of animals in one very small location. And as you've heard, this poses some potential problems. So here's another. So now the next couple slides are showing what's happening in Wisconsin, just really showing this boom that we're having in CAFOs over the past 30 years. So for the project, I worked with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources and was able to get permit information on all the CAFOs in the state for their entire history. So in the left panel, what you'll see is there were no CAFOs that were permitted or that were operating in Wisconsin back in 1994. Well, there were about 6. The first one was permitted in 1989, but you'll notice very, very empty. There's not a whole lot of CAFOs in the state. But then fast forward to 2017, and there are about 300 CAFOs. And what you'll notice and this is very good for our empirical analysis, but there are some areas with a lot of CAFO exposure, and there are some areas, generally up in the north, that have very little CAFO exposure. So what that'll allow us to do is compare the two types of watersheds to determine what's happening to the water as a result of CAFO exposure. And then, here again, here's the Red Cedar Watershed. Again, you're probably aware there's the turkey CAFOs up by Barron is what we're seeing around our part of the state. So then, again, like I said, just a couple slides to really show what's happening. These are taking off. This type of operation is moving forward. I like to say that the train has sort of left the station. We are really seeing an increase in CAFOs and an increase of the number of animal units that are now confined rather than out on smaller farms or potentially grazing. So again, over the past 30 years, we've seen a lot over the landscape. This is more of a spatial distribution versus just a time series of the number of these operations that are occurring. And as I also mentioned, this isn't just happening in Wisconsin. This is a United States issue. So the Wisconsin is actually, they're only in the top, I think 15 of states for the amount of CAFOs. So Iowa has hogs, North Carolina has poultry, Georgia has poultry. This is not a unique problem to Wisconsin. So with,
Zach,
yeah, sorry.
one thing I do want to bring up, though, that I do think is, I mean, there are many issues facing us, but I do think with some of these extreme storm weather issues around climate and CAFO manuring issues, I wish there were higher regulations preparing ourselves for these intense storms. And I'm deeply worried that we are actually going to be flushing all of this because of high rains. I mean, North Carolina, some of those big storms, all this CAFO stuff just went downstream. It was significant. And the media doesn't go back a week later and talk about it, right? So all this nutrients is just getting released. Anyway, I'll shut up there, Zach, sorry.
No, you're exactly correct. And that's, there's a slide down in a couple slides, but that's in essence what's happening. There's all this excess level manure nutrients that, again, I'll get there, but it used to be spread out. Now it's in one spot and we're land applying it. And it really is the new. So I said Wisconsin's regulations are the best in the country. And that's a really sad state of affairs because the nutrient management plans in Wisconsin are woefully inadequate, because what the nutrient management plans basically allow you to do is to land spread all of the manure that you have. And the ground cannot assimilate all of the manure nutrients. And that's exactly when it happens, is when we have a rain, then the manure nutrients that normally we would have liked to have been assimilated into the ground, assimilated into the crops, they have nowhere to go. And where is the lowest place to go is the water bodies. So it's 100% the result of this non-point source runoff. So the regulations require CAFOs to be point source dischargers, meaning a point source, meaning this is from a pipe. We know where the discharge is coming from or where the effluent is coming from. But in actuality, the CAFOs are not point source dischargers because they're land applying the manure. And the regulation saying, well, you can't dry discharge directly to a water body. Fine, right? That's great. But then allowing to, land apply within 5 miles, and again, I'll get to the economics, within 5 to 10 miles, because it costs such an unbelievable amount to ship your manure elsewhere. That's basically the same thing as saying, well, you're discharging from a pipe. It really is the same exact thing. And it's because of the rain. And you're 100% correct. Where does it go? Well, where's the lowest place in the watershed? It's the actual water bodies. And then, applying it to Dunn County, where's the lowest point in our watershed? It's right there on Lake Menomin. So we are, we're really experiencing the results of, the lack of regulation from these operations. So what are the research questions that we asked in this paper? And the first is just, what is happening over time? So there's many studies, particularly in the natural science literature, that use very small case studies or small geographic areas to determine the effect of CAFOs on water quality. And what we wanted to add to the literature, what we wanted to add to the debate, is some long scale, broad geographic research. So we really are able, based on using this historical population, using the entire state over time, we're able to better tease out the effects from CAFOs versus some other potentially unobserved factors, such as land slope or point in the watershed. So we're really trying to add a longer term study. And then obviously, as an economist, as people love to, I think this is why people are really interested in this study, is because, okay, CAFOs probably not going to be great for surface water quality, but what does that mean economically? When I first told my mom about this project, I said, yeah, we're looking at the effect of CAFOs on surface water quality. And she goes, duh. And I said, well, okay, first of all, we're trying to add a little bit more. And then also the dollars and cents. So, like I said, I think a lot of the reason that this paper and these results are getting some interest in the community and the state is because we put that dollars and cents on the external costs. So external meaning the CAFO is not factoring those costs into their production decisions. So normally I'm a dairy operator. I think, well, I have feed, I have land, I have animal, I have animal doctors, whatever. I have these costs, but there's also a cost to the water body, and that's not on the CAFO's balance sheet. So what we really want to look at is, well, these are externalities. These are costs that should be factored into the CAFO's balance sheet. And so identifying that, we're the first research project to actually identify how much the effects on water quality are worth. So what do we do? Well, like I said, we really use this so longitudinal data, meaning just over a long period of time, and we look at the same watersheds and the same CAFOs over time. So by using this long-term data of the same entity, we're really able to tease out the effects that might be unobserved in short-term cross-sectional studies. So when I mentioned things like soil quality or slope of the land, by looking at long-term and the same cross-sectional entities over time, you can tease out that sort of information, which previous studies are not able to do. And we also look at the entire history. So we're not just looking at a small point in time. So what we're saying is that the external validity, or the ability of us to say, well, this is what's happening in Wisconsin, we're better able to say this is what will happen in the future as well, because we're looking at every single CAFO that's ever been permitted in the state. And then so we look at the presence and their intensity over time and over the whole state on the surface water body concentrations of two very important pollutants, again, especially in our watershed, total phosphorus and ammonia, which is the reason that when I said I live on Lake Tainter in August, those are the pollutants that are the reason that I have to close the windows on really hot days. So very important pollutants, very important, again, for recreation, for people using water bodies. So that's why our dollars and cents figures are going to make such a big contribution. And then so how do we analyze this? It's a technique that's very common in economics and other social sciences, but it's called a difference in differences. And what I really would like you to think of a difference in differences is this treatment and control. So as social scientists, obviously we're studying people, we're studying the land, and we're using past data to try and figure out what's going on. We try and steal the methods very much from our natural science and our colleagues in medicine who, treatment control. We've all seen the COVID vaccine treatment and control. We do a very, very similar thing, but using past data. And the treatment group then are the watersheds with high exposure after the CAFOs came to the watershed. And then the control group are those watersheds with low CAFO exposure, low or no CAFO exposure, and those locations both before and after CAFO exposure. So we're able to really use this treatment and control based on the long scale large geographic coverage that we have to, in essence, mimic a treatment and control analysis. And as I've mentioned, the great thing about this is it really teases out those unobservable factors that may be impacting the results that are from previous CAFO studies that say, here's one CAFO, here's one water body, I'm pulling this water sample and attributing it automatically to the CAFO. So here's another thing I always get kicked off the dinner table for, is saying causation versus correlation. And I'm sure we've all heard that argument. That's a hill I will die on forever. But what this difference in differences and long-term large geographic study allows us to do is tease out that causal piece rather than just saying here's the correlation between these two. So what are the results? What do we find? The addition of one CAFO. So we like to work at the margins, or one additional unit. What is the impact of, say, permitting one additional CAFO in a Huck 8, which is just the water bodies that I showed, or the watersheds? In one additional CAFO, one additional CAFO in a Huck 8 will increase the average surface water body concentrations of it's 4.36 micrograms per liter of total phosphorus and 6.14 micrograms per liter of ammonia. So these numbers, might not mean a lot to some people, but the Wisconsin standards for impaired water bodies are determined via these concentrations. And what you'll notice here, this is about 10% of becoming an impaired water body. So if you're, let's say, at half of the impaired water body for phosphorus in Wisconsin, and you add 1 CAFO, you're about 10% closer to becoming an impaired water body. So pretty significant values, even though it may not look like it. And then comparing this to the sample mean values in the watersheds, total phosphorus, that's about a 1.7% increase and a 2.7% increase in ammonia compared to those sample means. So again, we're talking about pretty sizable amounts and of increased nutrients that are coming from 1 additional CAFO, given what is already on the in the watershed. So what causes it? So Lindsay, you had mentioned, what's the deal? Do we have good regulations? Why is this happening? And what we find is that it really is this extreme concentration. So imagine we have the Red Cedar Watershed, and I'm just going to give, as an instructor, coming up with analogies, I think it's like 50% of my job. So imagine we are in the watershed and we have 10 smaller farms with 10 cows each. And previously they were all spread around the watershed. Okay. So those cows are, their manure is on their location. That's great. What we find is that actually the land can assimilate the manure from those smaller farms, right? The land accepts it. It's fine. Manure is actually a great fertilizer, and we're just basically turning it into a waste by creating these concentrated entities. So over time, then what we're seeing is that those 10 farms with 10 cows each, we had 100 total in the landscape, now consolidate or concentrate into 1 larger farm with, say, 75 cows, but it goes in 1 location. Okay. And so that 1 location now, which used to have around 10 cows worth of manure, is getting the 75, and the land cannot handle all of that manure. And so even though we say, wow, we used to have 2 million cows, now we have 1.3 million cows. That means we should have way less manure in our landscape. Our water should be much cleaner, right? That would be the logic there. But it really isn't, because now all the manure from those 2 million cows that used to be spread out around the landscape, all of it is concentrated. In Wisconsin, we have about 320 CAFOs. So now all of the manure from the 1.3 million cows is in very concentrated locations. And all of that manure in one place is just basically getting spread on the land. The land is saying, okay, we can, if the land is talking, it says, I can handle this much manure. I can't handle the rest. And so the manure sits at the top of the landscape. Right. And when it sits at the top of the landscape, then what do we see? We see a big snow melt, or we see a big rain, and it washes right down to the lowest part, which is which is our water bodies. And so that's the mechanism, right? So it's great to say, well, here's the effects. Really, if we want to have true policy implications or figure out how to stop this problem, figuring out that mechanism is important. And we find this very strong negative spatial relationship between CAFOs and non-CAFOs. So what this really suggests is that those 10 farms that used to exist, well, some are going to go out of business and others are going to get soaked up into the concentrated operation, and they're just going to continue to grow and grow and grow. And so the manure is now really in one spot. And so this chart is a very good example of this extra phosphorus or this extra manure nutrients, and where it is, it's really on these large CAFOs that are the 700 head of dairy farms. So then our valuation, as I mentioned, this is a pretty big piece of our paper, and what we do is we basically are taking this 0.00436 milligrams per liter from each additional CAFO, and we're then putting it into monetized terms, right? So this is part of my job, and as an environmental and agricultural economist, is to take non-market things such as surface water, right? Imagine going to the farmer's market, boom, tomatoes, that's a market good because I can pay for the tomatoes. Somebody will accept my money and give me the tomato. but things like surface water quality are non-market goods because you can't go to the farmer's market and pay for your I'll have 1 unit of clean surface water, right? So these non-market benefits are really, they're abstract. And so identifying that is a big part of my job as an economist. And so these non-market benefits or damages in our case, when we have worse water quality from putting one more CAFO on the land, then people have worse swimming and boating experiences, right? Again, I've said it 10 times, I live on Tainter, so it's tough, right? I can't swim off my dock after July 20th. So that's going to be damages. That's costing something, right? From people using the lake, people hiking near the lake, or just people valuing clean water in general. So what we find,
your homes also, ability to recruit employers. I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, the economic hit is pretty significant.
very importantly, this number that I identify here is just for the resource itself. So
Wow.
this value is only water itself, what people would value that water being cleaner. And so think about the rest. Yes. And as an economist, we love to come up with models, right? So next steps are coming up with models to see, how does this hit tourism? How does this affect Menominee? How does this affect the Cobblestone Inn? There's absolutely ways to get out those numbers as well. This value is simply the resource itself. So what we find is just this difference in water quality. The average Wisconsin household would be willing to pay about $3 per year to avoid these damages from one additional CAFO in the watershed. And importantly, this value actually, it's pretty consistent with others in the literature for other types of applications. And so what we find then is that this water quality damage, so the additional CAFO, the marginal CAFO in the watershed, the water quality externality, or the costs that the CAFO is putting on society surrounding the CAFO itself, are about $203,000 per year. So $203,541 per year. So what does that mean, right? What does all this mean for Wisconsin? I'm already over a half hour. I'm sorry. I love hearing my own voice, apparently. But moving forward, what does this mean? What can we do? This is a pretty big number, right? This is a pretty big problem. What we're saying is, well, unfortunately, as I've mentioned, the train has already left the station. The state environmental protection agencies everywhere in the country, they're continuing to approve CAFO permits. We've had 20 plus new dairy CAFOs in Wisconsin over the last 2 years, bringing us to about 320 CAFOs. And so why is this happening? Well, what we're seeing, and again, it's the economics behind it, is these dairy CAFOs produce 10 times more sales revenue than the smaller observations. So we're looking at $1.4 billion. As I mentioned, I grew up wearing cheese on my head. Being America's dairy land is something that people are very proud of. So it's a very strong industry in Wisconsin, and the economics are very strong of continuing these sorts of operations, right? Nobody wants to go to the state legislature and say, here's how we hurt agriculture. It's the political economy is just a death sentence. So the state environmental protection agencies are continuing to approve these permits. And there's some arguments. So I don't know if people know what's happening in Kewaunee County, but they were actually recruiting CAFOs. So there's CAFO operators from Nebraska who are being given tax incentives to bring these large operations to places in Wisconsin because they can improve the local tax base, right? Just think about an operation paying $500 million of revenue versus $5 million of revenue. The $500 million is going to pay much higher taxes. They're going to have potential jobs associated with. So some local areas actually want these operations because it can improve their local tax base by sometimes over 10 times those of smaller operations. So what it's looking like is the economics are just too strong. You've seen the trends over the past 30 years. It's likely to continue into the future. So when I'm looking at what we do moving forward, how can we find these solutions? Well, it doesn't look like wishing CAFOs away or saying we need a moratorium on CAFOs. It's just not in the cards for the state of Wisconsin at this time. But what we find is that there's certainly ways that we can eliminate this external cost or these water quality impacts. So first off and foremost, and I've been preaching this from on top of Harvey Hall for the past 2 years, our CAFO permit fee in this state is $345. It's absurd, right? We just showed that the water quality costs alone are $203,000. So significantly increase this permit fee. Of course, increasing to $203,000 is probably not going to be feasible, but we can potentially increase it more. And actually, in the governor's most recent budget proposal, he suggested raising the CAFO permit fee to $545. So again, not $203,000, but a little bit more. And also a permit reissuance fee every 5 years of $3,000. So we're starting to move in that direction. I've been told by folks at the DNR that there's not a chance in heck that either of those go through, but the conversations are on the table. So we need to increase this. And what we can do then if we increase the fees, right? So the idea, economists, we love to say, well, you just internalize the externality. Well, if CAFOs are putting $203,000 worth of water quality damages on the community, they just need to internalize it and treat that cost as if it's feed or as if it's new land or whatever. Okay, so that would then decrease the quantity of these operations. Alternatively, what we can do is then deal with the manure, right? That's the problem. It really is the problem, is just the manure. So we can require wastewater treatment, potentially very, very expensive, right? But that's the situation we're at. Another option, and this is, I think, a really good one, especially if we can increase the CAFO permit fees a little bit. We can increase them from $345. If we get this $3,000 permit reissuance fee, that could give us something like $300,000 a year. Then what we could do is potentially have a CAFO slush fund that would really incentivize manure transport out of the area. So as I mentioned, right now, it's just too expensive to ship this liquid manure. It's really heavy. There's a lot of it. So they're spreading it right around the facility. If we shipped it out, we're importing millions of dollars per year in phosphorus fertilizer up the Mississippi River. Well, we could completely eliminate the need for that if we could ship the manure and use it as a fertilizer, just as it's intended to be. But again, that's expensive. So we could potentially use these funds to establish some sort of market or some sort of exchange. And a good example, they do this in Maryland currently. Basically, these CAFO farmers can be given cost shares to ship their manure. And then the final option, and again, really expensive, probably not very popular, are pipelines. We can ship to wastewater treatment plants, and this does occur. There are some wastewater treatment plants in one called Brown County Organics. They try and make it sound really nice, but Brown County Organics receives manure from several CAFOs that are around the area, and then they can treat it just like human waste would be treated. So basically, the two real options. We're not thinking that CAFOs are going to get shut down anytime soon. Maybe not now. Maybe in 50 years. Maybe in 80 years. Whatever. But for right now, the best solutions are making the CAFOs pay for these externalities and doing something with the manure. So writing better nutrient management plans, making the manure be spread out further, just not dumping it all 5 miles within your operation and then having it wash away into waters every time it rains.
Yeah. I would also like to say, Zach, as a person who lives in outside of Wheeler, so I live in Otter Creek, unrecognized township. I'm out there where all those CAFOs, a lot of the CAFOs are. I do think when it was 10 small little farms and the type of equipment and the type of people who are operating those farms, it felt like community and it felt scaled. Now I'm dealing with industrial tractors that I take up the entire 35 just getting home. The scale of this equipment, aerial spraying, I mean, these are industrial farms at such a high scale. And I just think that we've somehow we still romantically think they're just these 10 little dotted farms with 100 cows. And those are the same people, but this is a very different model.
It is.
But I think politically they're just seen as like the soft little cow that no one can touch. And until we're honest about that impact, I worry. I think in 80 years, they still could be doing significant damage. So I don't know. I just feel like as a resident who lives in the middle of all this, I have no rights. I have no, they don't have to tell me when they're spraying chemicals on me. They don't have to tell me what kind of chemicals they're spraying on me. Well, we basically said, do whatever you want. From my
Well,
lens, anyway.
No, you're 100% correct. The thing that, kind of, that just blows my mind forever is this idea. You're right. It's, well, we can't hurt ag, right? And, hurting ag, I've said it many times. We can have cheese, we can have fish, right?
Right.
We're not hurting ag by requiring ag to pay for the damages that they're producing. Just compare it to any other industry, right?
Right.
Ag is an industry, and
Yeah.
we're basically bending over backwards to say, well, that's farming. America's built on farming. Everybody likes to have food. That's fantastic. And I agree with that. But any other industry, look what's happening now. Coal-fired power plants are going out of business left and right. Well, that's just an industry just like ag. They're just providing, they're just trying to make, but they are producing external costs. They are harming people.
Right.
And what we're seeing here is that there's external, I told you I wouldn't use too many econ terms, but just the fact that these costs are not internalized on these operations
Yeah.
doesn't mean that we're saying you have to go out of business, right? It's just you have to pay your fair share, and that's what we're really advocating for. And my analogy, my kids are in hockey, okay, and we have to work 50 hours in the concession stand, which, holy cow, that's a lot of hours if you ask me. But if I don't want to work those hours, then what do I have to do? I have to pay to buy out of them, right? So that's all we're saying. If the CAFOs, the CAFOs imagine their manure or their spreading or their whatever their waste is, that's their hours in the concession stand. If you don't want to do something with the manure, if you don't want to treat it, if you don't want to ship it, then you just have to pay for it. And that's what really we're advocating for, is this idea that you just need to internalize the cost, just as if the manure was feed, because we don't give ag free feed just because they're farmers, right? What we're advocating for is you just need to pay for what you're putting on other people.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Zach, I'd like to ask a question and also add something else to your list of things we could be doing. One question, when you present this material, when I've talked about ag paying their share of the damages, I get, that I'm trying to destroy and I'm down on farmers. My question to you is, when you present this material, do they say you can't prove that the cost is totally borne by farms? And do they disagree with your point? Or are they saying we can't bear the cost because that would destroy farms? Or do they agree that your analysis is accurate based upon a longitudinal study, that it's not due to natural phosphates, it's not due to phosphates from other
Yes.
things? Have they agreed with your point, but they don't want to bear the cost?
Yes. So one thing that, I should say is, throughout all of my interactions, the operators, they understand that it's a problem. Most people understand that this is a potential problem and they want to help solve the problem. Right? Nobody's saying, all right, I don't care about anything. I want to destroy waters, because they still live here. They still are, even if people don't fish, they still understand that this is happening. My understanding is most farmers, most operators that I've talked to want to help solve the problem. But then when it comes to the cost, how can you help solve the problem? That's the rub. What's been argued is this increase from 345 to 545 that the governor has proposed. They're arguing that that's too much, that'll put them out of business, that their margins are so tight that any sort of additional cost is going to put them out of business. And that's the part where I would tend to disagree, because our number, this $203,000 that we see from the marginal CAFO, that's less than 4% of the average dairy farm's total sales revenue each year. So if 4% is going to put you out of business, I don't know how I can argue that, because yes, I can argue. I would say no, it's not, right? Otherwise, the other parts of your operation need to be, you need to look deep into those. But it really is, 90% of these operators, they do want to help. They want to be involved in the conversation, but they're not willing to kind of look at any of their profitability going away to try and help. I mean, what they do is they have, community breakfasts. I mean, you can go to the farm, you can go to the CAFO and you can pet the cow and you can have free breakfast. And it's kind of this community, they're trying to make it a community thing. But then when it comes to the pocketbook, it doesn't seem like they're willing to help.
That's been my experience as well. And I agree with you. I think, I think most operators want their water and they're not trying to be harmful in any way. They're also trying to make a living. And, but that's why I want to make sure that when you say that they're not disputing the cause of the problem. They're saying they just can't afford it. The other thing in terms of the other point I wanted to make is that there are some other things we can be doing besides the list that you have on there. Currently, there is a proposal for revisions in 151 that would relate to nitrate use. And they had an economic analysis. And Zach, I don't know if your group was there for that economic analysis with DNR, but there was, and maybe you were, and if you were, I'd love to hear your results. But when they were talking about that, there was a tremendous feedback from the manufacturer, the various farm representatives about the economic cost, but with not the same amount of information about the economic cost if we don't do something. There was an imbalance in that. So the information is not getting out there. And now the Land Conservation Group developed these revisions that really potentially has some impact on the nitrates. How do we get your study into the hands of the people where there was the economics from the dairy representation was very much the opposite. Have you already done that? Where are we at, about getting the information you have out to people?
Fresh. I'm still kind of, I don't think I was a part of those conversations. I'm relatively new at Stout, but what I'm doing today is the hope, right? I'm trying to get this information out. I have contacts at DNR. I'm working on a grant project at Madison, and they have louder mouths and more ears than I do. So I'm trying. If you have connections, if you have, I think that's part of the goal of me talking today is just to get outreach and to have these numbers known and to have this be a part of the conversation. Yeah. Like I mentioned, I talked to folks at DNR about the proposed increases. And so I'm trying to get to get this stuff out there, and I'll shove, like I said, I'm shouting from the top of Harvey Hall that $345 a year is a joke. Yeah. And again, I really want to not be seen as, the guy who's trying to shut down dairy in the state, because it's not at all what we're trying to do. We're just trying to have okay, so here's my final econ jargon. Resources need to be allocated efficiently in a society. And when outside parties are paying for the decisions of other groups, that's not efficient. There's waste, and we need to do something about it. And, taxing and shipping. And I think there's a lot of solutions. I'd love to hear you said you had another potential option.
I think it's important to do that because it's being considered right now. It's, these proposals, and they don't talk about the CAFO increase. What they talk about is the amount of nitrate that can actually be applied to the land and being supervised by land conservationists. So it has gotten tremendous pushback from and would have a direct, like I said, a direct impact on nitrates. And I know that Steve is trying to get in there, but I just want to make a point right now. There is some advocacy possibilities that your information would be tremendously important for.
Okay. Yeah, I'd be happy to share my slides. I think, Steve, I don't know, did you share the paper with the group? I think you did.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, one thing I think too, Zach, is I think a lot of people don't quite understand the scale of a CAFO farm. And that these are $1 million operations. And so when they still think of these as these, so I love my rural neighbors, but they think, oh, they're these poor little farmers They're driving beat up pickup trucks. They're barely able to get by. And I'm like, no, man, they're my neighbors. They're driving that $65,000 truck that I would never be able to afford. So is there a way for folks to really understand, or maybe this has already been done, that, an average CAFO is $2 million. The manager makes 190,000, an average
It's
employee-
five. It's
Right,
5
exactly,
million.
or whatever. And in addition to that, so this $345 fee is a drop in the bucket, and we have to scale this to the. I mean, we have to act like this is a business,
Yeah.
right? Anyway,
Yeah.
so
That's what I'm trying. Yeah.
so I don't know if that data set layered in with yours might help, because I know these people, they're doing good.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, Steve, thanks.
Yeah, first of all, I've really enjoyed your presentation, so thank
Thanks,
you.
Steve.
I'd like to just make a few kind of comments recapping some of the things you said, and I'm going to pose a question, not that it's more of a rhetorical question, but you said, well, we can have both cheese and, well, can we continue to have both cheese and fish? And you're sort of making a concern that maybe not, and you talk about how all this is going into the Red Cedar and Lake Monoman. And I think of, we're trying to fight this problem, this algae problem. And it almost seems like it's kind of we're just going in the wrong direction. It's almost like it's kind of feels hopeless, the way things are going now. And then you talked about the solution. You talked about maybe having an on-site waste treatment plant. And each CAFO's owner would have his own waste treatment property, or maybe shipping the manure out. And then I think, well, if they had their own waste treatment plant, then they could ship the product from that as a fertilizer around the country and make some money from that waste treatment plant. But a waste treatment plant costs money. And maybe there's a budget item there that we can help CAFO's owners have local waste treatment plants. And maybe that's already in the works. I don't know. But that was a thought that went through my mind, and I'm just wondering if you had any comments.
No, they're great points. And I hope, I'm sorry that if I made it seem hopeless. I didn't mean to make it seem hopeless.
No, that was, no.
Okay. What's hopeless, or what I think is bad policy or bad advocacy, is saying no more CAFOs, we should shut them down. This is right. That's just not going to happen. So in my work, in my circles that I run, considering the political economy, or considering the chances that something actually goes down or happens, is an important thing to consider. And just this idea that saying no more CAFOs ever, they're bad, they're evil, is not the right way to go about the problem, because this is the direction we've been traveling for 30 years. It's even stronger than before. There are ways to live with CAFOs that are better than, basically shooting yourself in the foot before arguing, before any discussion has begun. And so the discussion of, so wastewater treatment plants are one way to help the water quality externality, because, basically all this manure that they're spreading on the field is not treated, right? I mean, we look at the Menominee wastewater treatment plant, and that's completely treated. That's human waste. It's now clean. They have ways to make that discharge clean. The cow manure that's going on the fields is not touched. It's sluiced, so it's liquid form, but that's it. So they could possibly treat it, but as you mentioned, the costs are very, very high. So this is why I recommend increasing the permit fee is probably more feasible, or shipping the manure is more feasible, because a wastewater treatment plant, to the scale that each CAFO would need, there's I don't know if you saw in the paper, there's a pretty jarring statistic that a 1,200 dairy CAFO produces the same amount of manure or waste as a 48,000 person town. So we're looking at, I don't know, like I said, I'm from the east part of the state. So we're looking at Sheboygan from one CAFO. in the watershed. So Sheboygan has to have a wastewater treatment plant, but it's a lot easier to spread those costs. So it's something, a new wastewater treatment plant could cost upwards of $70 million. So it's pretty expensive. That's why we're kind of pushing more for the taxes or the fees. But one thing you do make a very good point is digesters. So with a digester, and this, they have, this is where we could combine pipelines and have a digester. The only problem with the digesters is that it does nothing to the nutrients. So the digesters are great. They could produce a little bit of energy. We could get some fertilizer out of it, but it's the end product of the digester is just as heavy. So it's also really expensive to ship, and it does nothing to the nutrients. So you could basically produce energy from a digester, but then what you have left is just the same thing as manure. Really, it's the same amount of nutrients. So if the issue is potentially profitability, if that's the argument, right? This is basically my job now, is arguing what we can do to not harm profitability when to also save our ecosystem. It would certainly help with profitability, but unfortunately the nutrients have to go somewhere, and they just come out on the other side.
What kind of acceptance are you getting from the legislators on your paper, if any?
I mean, it's mostly falling on the ears that you would expect it to be falling on, right? So there's the individuals who think that we need to protect our resources are saying, yes, this is great, let's talk about it. And then the ones who are more in favor of, continuing the ag industry are, again, it's just as Kathy, as you said, they're really making the argument that this is a profitability issue, that these farms, that these operations are they're really operating on the margins. That what that means is that their profits, their take-home economic profits, are so low that anything to mess up that equilibrium is going to make them go out of business, which, again, me looking at the numbers, I find hard to believe. Yeah.
Zach, Cheryl I don't know if Cheryl was, saying that, that we need to get off, but maybe she needed to get off.
Okay.
In terms of your topic, do you have statistics about the profitability of this overproduction of milk, the overproduction of corn? Now that the corn prices are up again, people are going to be cutting down their woodlots. They're going to plunk in. We're going to get even more corn. Has there been any discussion about the profitability or lack of profitability of overproduction?
So there's really been not the lack of profitability or what farmers are going to do to their land, but the prices, the commodity prices, and this is sort of where I said at the beginning, the policy in this country has really been, look at the last couple farm bills. If you're producing more output, then you're profitable, right? The more you produce, the more you ship out, the better you are. So the fact that now, and I kind of was sad, I'm not going to start shorting corn anytime soon, but the fact that corn prices are going so high, I think that this is going to be an even harder argument to make, because yes, absolutely, putting your land into row crop agriculture is a good business right now. And like I said, I'm working with a group out of Madison where it's trying to get transformative agriculture, so moving back to grassland, having perennial hays, and potentially showing that can be profitable too, right? Because grass-fed beef, as I'm sure we've all been to the co-op, that stuff goes for a pretty penny.
Yeah.
But that increase is not even close to what you can make with row crop agriculture, especially now with what's happening to those commodity prices. So the conversation with farmers on the ground has been difficult now, because people don't want to say, yeah, we'll take our row crop out of production, or sure, we'll minimize our production, when big business is paying right now. It's an unfortunate economic situation. Yeah.
Hi, Zach. Thank you so much for this. Having been a farmer's daughter many years ago, I have an interest though, because where I grew up, there's a CAFO,
Mhm.
and the smell is just overpowering. So what about air pollution?
Okay. So it's a really, really good question. And, I try to package the whole deal. This is sort of my first foray into this full cost accounting. There have been other studies, and what we find is the water quality impacts dwarf the rest of the costs.
Yep.
So this $203,000 that we identify, there's a paper that identifies the impacts on housing prices, and it's
Mhm.
something only like $2,500. So if you're downwind a CAFO, your house goes down by $2,500. The air pollution is about $70,000 per CAFO. So what we see is, it's really the water quality. So that's why, I'm preaching from the mountains that yes, we need to factor in all of this stuff, but first on the list needs to be water quality, because
Well,
these.
Excuse me. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's fine. I'm just saying water, these effects are much larger, but you're 100% correct. There's certainly other costs that need to be accounted for. There's air pollution, there's housing prices, there's, fishing catches, there's medical costs. But what we find is that of all these costs, of all the potential external costs, water quality is something like 75-80% of all these costs. So if we're going to attack a problem, I think that water is what needs to be first.
I think a good argument could be made that if you attack the water quality problem, the residual benefits would be cleaner air
Yes.
and not as much effect on housing.
Absolutely. Co-benefits, right? Although now co-benefits aren't allowed to count. Well, last administration, co-benefits weren't allowed to count, but now I absolutely think that's a great point. Yeah. Do something with them newer, spread it out farther away, make them pay. That's what a tax would do, would be decreasing the queue, decreasing the quantity of that production, because again, if you're factoring in those production decisions, then you're going to lower your output. Lowering your output would absolutely help with the smell. It would help with the air pollution.
Yeah,
It
well,
would be a
I
great
know
first start.
Cheryl had another commitment and she had to log out, and we've kept you over.
You're great. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. I appreciate it. I'm glad that
There is
you.
one last question from anybody. How about if I allow that question and then we'll say thank you to
Yeah.
Zach. Any
Thank
last
you.
question?
I have one more question. Well, actually, I have several, but
We love you, Kathy.
so in talk with the former Dunn County conservationist this morning about another issue. Well, actually, it was about water quality. And, he was saying that one encouraging note he has in Dunn County is that there is a greater interest in grazing. Do you have or know of what, and I think probably everybody in this on this call or this Zoom has seen the increased conversation, increased training about grazing. Do you have any sense of a change in numbers about grazing relative to the, very dramatic numbers that you had about CAFO? And I know that they would be very, very small in comparison to the stuff that you're talking about thus far. But, any information about that in terms of numbers around Dunn County,
Okay.
state, the United States?
So are you talking about number of acres or number of operations, or the value of the economic value to water quality improvements? I have done
or numbers of cows, number of
Okay.
operations, do we have any kind of, other than, a casual conversation with our former Dunn County conservationist about grazing
Sure.
and the number of emails? Do we have any data that might be getting to that change?
So not at this point, I have not seen it, but I have worked, there's a group in Marathon County that I'm working with that's going to switch from row crop to grazing, and the benefits are huge. I mean, we're talking 500 pounds of phosphorus per year reduction from something as small as 150 acre row crop farm. And then using the same economic valuation, we came up with something over $100,000 of benefits per year from switching from row crop to grazing, and that's for one 150 acre farm plot. So this is certainly something that I'm working on. Grazing is very interesting to me. And like I said, there are certainly supply chain profitability conversations to be had there, because you can definitely make good money grazing, and people just don't know it. And I think it's, you're already on the forefront if you're talking about, I assume, is that Dan? Is he the former?
Dan and
Okay, yeah.
Chase is working on that. They are there. And I have not seen the kind of numbers you just talked about, and maybe they're all around me and I've just missed them.
No, what if grazing is something that the group has been talking about, like I said, that's sort of been my side pet that I really like, is the grazing conversation and the switching and quantifying those economic benefits. If that's something that the group is actively involved with, I would be more than interested in, doing the same sort of work that I've done for Marathon County, but here in my backyard. I think that would be very interesting. So if grazing is on your table,
Yeah.
then
One thing sorry, Kathy, I want to jump in real quick. One thing I do think also, we are seeing trends I run a conservation organization and I'm work 20 counties, so I'm not just in Dunn, but
okay.
We are seeing more greening, right? So electric cars, like there is an awakening happening within the consumer that I think is so powerful, because I did local food systems 25 years ago in Vermont. I helped start farmers markets when there wasn't any, And so to see where it is today, I'm like, holy biscuit, green mining. I mean, we never heard of things like this before. So I also believe that if we're able to capture that consumer interest, those shifts of how we're producing products are going to happen, because people won't buy it anymore. They're like, I'm not going to buy dirty crap and destroy my planet for my kids. We're done that model. So I think the more we energize folks in Dunn and also find concrete places they can buy local food, really support the solutions too in our messaging outside of the regulation and policy, I think there could be some possible win-wins that way too.
So that's the EV electric vehicle analogy is one that I make every chance I get.
Yeah.
Right. In 1980, who would have ever thought that we would be going completely electric vehicle by 2050? Right. It's pumping out gas guzzling, diesel, lead-based gasoline to now. So I think I 100% agree that I think that we're still in the early phases, right? This model has begun 30 years ago, but I would be very surprised if by 2100, again, it's a long way away, and that's why I'm talking about the now and the solutions for the now. But I would be very, very surprised if this model made it to 2100 or made it 80 years down the line. I see that shift as well, but we're just maybe 30, 40 years behind vehicles, behind green energy, that sort of stuff.
Yep. Okay. Great. Sorry, Kathy.
Zach, go ahead.
Zach, have you talked with Chase Cummings, the new conservationist?
I have not yet.
Do you mind if I could connect the two of you together about the conversation you've had today? And
please.
Okay.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thumbs up.
You bet. And please, everybody, my email, I'll share, maybe Steve, I'll send you the slides when I'm done here. And then if you can share them with the group, my email's on there. I would be more than interested in working with the group, doing this sort of outreach stuff. I'm, like I said, I'm trying to get this information out there, affect the policy. Standard academics sit in my office and then publish a paper in an econ journal that's read by, I'm going to be generous and say 5 economists. I'd like more people to see it. So.
Love it.
Thank you, Zach.
Thank you, guys. Thanks for everything.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks.